This is lecture number 1, Africa's Geography and Climate. Africa is a very diverse place, both geographically and culturally. The geography in Africa has influenced where people live and have settled over time, leading to this diversity. There are many barriers, geographically speaking, in Africa that have separated the different regions. Over time, people have learned to adapt to these barriers that separate various regions. Africa is the world's second largest continent. It's 3 times the size of the U.S. There are 53 nations in Africa currently. Africa straddles the equator and extends thousands of miles north and south of there. The Atlantic Ocean is to the west of Africa, while the Indian Ocean lies to its east. Africa is a vast continent, which basically means it's massive. Moreover, Africa sits right in the middle of world transportation routes, making it a pretty important place in terms of world trade. There are 4 main regions in Africa: North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. Each region is really unique. Africa has so much geographic diversity as well. Each region has a variety of climates. Even with all its diversity, Africa is basically a giant plateau. There are these really unique landforms there called escarpments. Escarpments are really steep cliffs that divide a plateau from the coastal plains. Africa's rivers flow from these elevated plateau regions, forming cataracts or massive waterfalls and rapids. Victoria Falls is a great example of this. It is Africa's largest waterfall. Some people think that this is the largest waterfall in the world, although not the highest or widest. It's located along the Zambezi River in between Zambia and Zimbabwe. Another important landform in Africa is the Great Rift Valley. This is a split in the African continent, sort of like a giant fault in the Earth's surface. 2 of the world's deepest lakes are located in the Great Rift Valley. These include Lake Tanganyika and Lake Malawi. There are many rivers in Africa as well, like the Nile in Egypt, and then there are also rivers like the Congo River and the Niger River. Don't forget the Zambezi River in southern Africa, and then a lot of these rivers have contributed over time to how people live and where people have settled. All right, so let's move on to the mineral or natural resources that we can find in Africa. In terms of mineral wealth, African nations sell many valuable minerals to other countries, including conflict materials or minerals used in all of our smartphones. Yeah, so all those iPods and MP3 players need complex circuit boards made out of things like copper. You can find a lot of these minerals in parts of Africa. Unfortunately, many countries in Africa don't really have the ability to harness these resources for a number of reasons, which we'll get into in this unit. Not to mention, there's an uneven distribution of resources throughout Africa. All right, let's move on to weather patterns. Weather patterns in Africa have helped influence cultural development across the continent. The equator runs through the middle of Africa. 80% of Africa is located in what we call the tropics. So what are the tropics? This is an area between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. This means that most parts of Africa have warmer climates. Cooler climates in Africa will probably only occur in highland regions or places with a higher elevation. Yeah, so a place like Ghana along the western coast of Africa, which is at sea level, will have a super warm climate, whereas a place located at a higher elevation like Nairobi, Kenya, which is well over 5,000 feet above sea level, it has a climate that is in the 60s to 70s with chilly night temperatures. There is a pattern throughout Africa of both wet and dry seasons. Generally speaking, it rains more in the countries that are located along the equator, and the further one gets away from the equator, north or south, the less it rains. That's why it's so dry in places like Egypt and to the south in places like the Kalahari Desert. Differences in rainfall between countries majorly impacts the types of crops people can grow in given nations. There are 4 major climate zones in Africa. Each zone is really unique, adding to Africa's diverse structure, or in addition to its climates, its diversity. I just messed that up. Anyway, there is a tropical wet climate region along the equator where many rainforests are located. Rainforests tend to be hot and humid. One would think that with so much rain and vegetation that the soil would be great for farming in these areas. Unfortunately, that's not the case in many parts of these tropical climate areas in Africa. Why is that? Well, basically, constant rain is always washing away the soil, taking valuable nutrients with it. This is called leaching. The next zone is the tropical wet and dry zone. Almost half of the continent has this type of climate, characterized by the savanna, a grassland. There are tropical savannas located near the equator which receive quite a bit of rain, and then further away from the equator you have dry savanna regions with little rain and plant life. Millions of Africans farm these areas anxiously await the rains that come at certain times of the year. If there's too little rain, this results in frequent droughts, which can result in mass famine or hunger in parts of Africa. If there's too much rain, flooding occurs, which can also hamper food production. One of the most pressing issues in this climate zone is sometimes called desertification. Human interaction with the environment in Africa has resulted in people overgrazing the soil, turning the topsoil into dust. Desertification literally means that the land is turning into a desert. The third climate zone in Africa includes deserts. Deserts cover about 40% of Africa. Some of the notable ones include the Sahara in North Africa, which means desert in Arabic. And then there's also the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa and the Namib Desert along the coast of Namibia in southern Africa. Finally, a small portion of the African continent enjoys a Mediterranean climate zone, similar to the climate found in southern France or Spain. This includes areas along the northern coasts of Africa, like in Morocco and Tunisia, and in the south, like along the coast of South Africa. These places can be compared to the climate found in Los Angeles, California. So to review, there are 4 main climate zones in Africa: the tropical wet zone, the tropical wet dry zone, the desert zone, and the Mediterranean climate zone. There are also a lot of disease-carrying insects that breed in tropical regions in Africa that I'd like to talk about now, like mosquitoes. They spread malaria, which kills up to 1 million kids a year in different parts of Africa. There's also something called sleeping sickness that is spread by the tsetse fly in parts of Africa and is why some parts of the country can't support herds of grazing animals or livestock. It particularly affects cattle. Other types of flies carry diseases like river blindness. Other diseases are caused by parasites in various parts of Africa. The population of Africa is at almost 800 million, but population density is low overall. These types of issues make it difficult to settle many parts of the continent. This has also made it necessary to adapt in various ways to the continent. Over time, people have migrated across Africa. Different societies have emerged in Africa based on climate zones and these adaptations. Most people live in the savanna regions of Africa, but frequent migrations over time have resulted in similarities between people throughout Africa, most notably in terms of language. Although there are over 1,000 languages spoken in Africa, there are language families. Each language family has similar roots. If we look at the roots of words across Africa, it can give us a clearer picture of where people settle over time and their migratory patterns. That's all for today. Thanks for listening. Bye.